The moving truck idled at the curb, engine humming like an impatient beast. I was finally moving into my new home, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a garage big enough for my motorcycle and tools. Everything was perfect until she showed up. Her name, Patricia Langley. President of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. 50-something, platinum blonde bob, and the kind of sunglasses that made her look like she was constantly judging the sun itself. She pulled up in her beige Lexus, parked it sideways across my driveway, and stepped out like she owned the asphalt beneath her kitten heels. "You can't unload here," she barked, arms crossed, lips pursed like she'd just swallowed a lemon. "This is an HOA community. Moving trucks must be registered with the board 72 hours in advance. Page 12 of the covenants." I stared at her, then at my truck. "It's a public street," I said, "and that's my driveway." She pointed at a laminated HOA badge clipped to her blouse like it gave her divine authority. "You're already starting off on the wrong foot, Mr. Yarden O'Connell," I replied. "And I'm not in the mood for games. I have a moving crew on the clock and my son's waiting inside." She ignored every word, walked back to her car and locked it, still blocking my driveway. One of the movers, a guy named Rico, looked at me and said, "Man, you want us to carry this couch across the lawn? It's gonna tear up your sod." "Hold up," I muttered, pulling out my phone. I calmly walked to the sidewalk, snapped a few photos of Patricia's car license plate, the way it was blocking my driveway, the whole thing. I even caught her glaring at us from the driver's seat like a gargoyle at a cathedral. Then I called the local towing company. Not the one 10 minutes down the road. No, I called my buddy Tad, who runs a recovery yard out by the interstate 80 miles away. Best part, he's licensed for private impounds. 30 minutes later, a big flatbed rolled up. Patricia jumped out of her car like it was on fire. "You can't tow this." "I'm the HOA president," she yelled, waving her badge like it was a force field. The tow driver didn't even blink. "You're parked illegally across a private driveway. That's a violation of municipal code. You'll regret this," she screeched as her Lexus was winched onto the truck. I leaned against the porch rail and said, "You can pick it up tomorrow. Yard opens at 9. Patricia was fuming. Her face was the same color as the HOA newsletter. She probably printed herself bright red. The rest of the move went smoothly. She stood there muttering threats for a while before storming off on foot. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up to the muffled thud of someone banging on my front door like they were trying to knock it off the hinges. I opened it still half asleep, hair wild, wearing a ratty t-shirt from my construction days. Patricia stood there with a clipboard, flanked by 2 men I hadn't seen before. One was tall, wearing a blazer he clearly thought made him look official. The other had a gut that strained the buttons of his polo shirt, which bore the same Oak Ridge HOA crest as Patricia's badge. "You're in violation of several community standards," she snapped without greeting. "These gentlemen are here to document and issue formal citations." "Are either of you from the city?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Because if not, you're trespassing." The blazer guy cleared his throat. "We're authorized compliance officers contracted by the HOA. We're here to inspect for infractions." "Great," I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the porch. "Be sure to note the fresh paint, the neat lawn, and the fact that I haven't even lived here 24 hours. They didn't move. Patricia flipped a page on her clipboard. "You failed to submit a foliage declaration. Your garbage bins are visible from the street, and your mailbox is 1.5 inches too tall." I stared at her, then at the 2 guys. "Is this a comedy sketch?" The guy in the polo stepped forward, pulled out his phone, and started taking photos of my rosebush. That's when I noticed my neighbor across the street, a gray-haired woman in a gardening hat, watching from behind her hedge. She saw me looking and gave a subtle shake of her head, mouthing, "She's done this before." I turned back. "You're going to want to stop photographing my property. That's a privacy violation unless you've got a court order." Patricia scoffed and handed me a yellow slip. "These fines are due in 72 hours. I didn't take it. You'll be hearing from my attorney. That stopped them. The blazer guy blinked. Are you threatening legal action? Not a threat, I said. A promise. They left, but not before Patricia muttered something about setting an example. I watched them walk down my driveway, and that's when I noticed something else. My mailbox flag was bent at a weird angle. I walked over to check it, and found a thin scratch running down the side like someone had tried to pry it open. I reported it to the local police. Officer Mendez came by later that afternoon, took photos, and raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the HOA compliance sweep. You're not the first to complain, he said, jotting notes. But unless you have a camera or a witness, it'll be hard to prove who tampered with it. I didn't have a camera. Yet, that night, I drove to the hardware store and dropped $300 on a full outdoor security system, 4 high-res cameras with motion detection, cloud storage, and night vision. I spent the next few hours installing them, making sure every angle of my property was covered. The next morning, I had an alert waiting on my phone. Motion detected at 2:16 a.m. I pulled it up. There, clear as day, was Patricia walking up my driveway in a bathrobe and slippers, holding a flashlight and what looked like a pad of sticky notes. She stuck one on my trash bin, then tried to shove something into the side of my mailbox. She walked off 10 seconds later, glancing around like she was casing a joint. I downloaded the footage, saved it to 3 separate drives, and printed screenshots. Then I called Officer Mendez. He came by again that afternoon, and when I showed him the footage, his expression shifted from professional to annoyed. This changes things, he said. Tampering with a mailbox is a federal offense, and entering your property like that's criminal trespass. He filed a formal report and told me he'd be running it up the chain. I asked if I could press charges. He nodded slowly. You can, and frankly you should. Later that evening, I had visitors, different ones. A couple from 2 doors down, Mark and Brenda, showed up with a bottle of wine and nervous smiles. We heard what happened with Patricia, Brenda said. She's been running this place like a private kingdom for years. Most of us are afraid to speak up. She fined us last spring for having a basketball hoop in our driveway, Mark added. Said it was a nuisance to the aesthetic harmony. We took it down, but our kids haven't let us forget it. I invited them in, poured some wine, and showed them the footage. They were stunned. She always denies it, Brenda whispered. Tells people she's just enforcing the rules. I asked if they had any evidence of her overstepping. Mark nodded. We've got a paper trail. Fines issued for imaginary violations, threats about liens, even a couple of letters she sent pretending to be from the city code office. I kept everything. We made a plan. I spent the next week quietly gathering more stories. I spoke to a retired firefighter named Lewis, who had been fined for hanging an American flag on a pole that wasn't pre-approved. A single mom named Dana had received a cease and desist letter for planting sunflowers in her front yard. An old veteran named Carl got fined for not power washing his driveway after a rainstorm. Each one had paperwork. Each one had dates, signatures, and in a few cases, forged letterheads. I took everything to a friend of mine, Rachel, a city council member I'd served with on a zoning review board years ago. She took one look at the documents and narrowed her eyes. This isn't just petty. This is fraud. She looped in the city attorney, who launched an investigation. Turns out, Patricia had been fabricating code enforcement letters, forging signatures, and even collecting administrative fees that weren't listed in any of the HOA's governing documents. She'd created a slush fund, one that wasn't reported to the treasurer or the board. The fallout was immediate. 3 weeks later, the city issued a cease and desist against the HOA's current enforcement practices. Patricia was served with a subpoena. Her so-called compliance officers vanished overnight, and the board, turns out, it was just her and 2 friends she'd appointed without a vote. A new election was ordered. I ran, not because I wanted to be part of the HOA, but because I wasn't about to let someone like her take the reins again. Brenda ran too, so did Lewis. Even Carl, the 80-year-old Marine, threw his hat in the ring. We didn't just win. We swept the board. Patricia tried to fight it, claimed the election was invalid, claimed harassment. She even filed a restraining order, which the judge threw out in under 5 minutes after watching the footage of her creeping around my mailbox like a raccoon in a bathrobe. When the city completed their audit, they found over 70 falsified citations, nearly $20,000 in unauthorized fees, and one forged compliance document that listed a dead city official as the signatory. Patricia was arrested. She's currently awaiting trial on charges of fraud, identity theft, and criminal misrepresentation. As for the HOA, we rewrote the bylaws, brought in an independent auditor, created a resident oversight committee, and we banned fines for anything not explicitly listed in the charter. The basketball hoop went back up, the sunflowers bloomed, and for the first time since moving in, I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, and watched the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the street without fear of being written up. Patricia's Lexus, still sitting in Tad's impound yard. He says he's charging storage fees. I told him to bill her directly. By the time Patricia's trial date was posted on the county docket, the neighborhood had undergone a quiet but powerful transformation. With the old board dismantled and the HOA under temporary city oversight, long-standing residents began emerging from the shadows figuratively and, in Carl's case, literally. He'd taken to sitting on his porch every afternoon, polishing a brass telescope and watching the street like a retired sentry. The new board had barely settled into our temporary office in the converted pool house when the first ripple of something deeper began to surface. Brenda burst through the door one Tuesday morning with a manila folder clutched like a live grenade. "You need to see this right now," she said, eyes wide. She dumped the folder onto the meeting table. Inside were copies of bank statements, real ones, not the sanitized monthly summaries Patricia used to hand out at her community briefings. These were downloaded straight from the HOA's actual account, which we'd only just recovered access to through the city's administrative handoff. Mark leaned over, scanning the statements. "Wait, that can't be right. Look at these transfers. Who the hell is Ridgeview Community Solutions LLC?" Lewis tapped the page. "That's not a vendor we ever hired. And this withdrawal, $10,000 every month, like clockwork." I picked up the folder and flipped through. The transfers had started almost 2 years ago, always on the first Friday. The destination account was tied to a P.O. box in another county, one known for its lenient corporate registration policies. Rachel, our city council contact, called in a forensic accountant the same afternoon. Within 48 hours, he confirmed what we suspected. Patricia had created a shell company, funneled over $200,000 in resident dues into it, and used the funds to pay for everything from luxury hotel stays to private legal counsel. "This isn't just fraud," he said as he packed up his laptop. "This is embezzlement, money laundering, and wire fraud across state lines. You'll need the feds." Things escalated from there. The FBI was brought in. They arrived in unmarked cars, dressed like your average IT consultants, and quietly set up shop in the city offices. Brenda and I were called in for interviews. They asked about everything: Patricia's behavior, the structure of the old board, any unauthorized purchases, and even the HOA's election process. "She ran the place like a cult," Brenda told them flatly. "You either followed her rules or she fined you into submission." The agents nodded, scribbling notes. One of them leaned forward and asked, "Did she ever suggest retaliation against non-compliant residents?" I paused. "She didn't suggest, she acted." "There's surveillance footage and at least a dozen residents who can testify." Soon, subpoenas were issued for email accounts, HOA meeting transcripts, and vendor contracts. The city clerk uncovered a disturbing paper trail. Patricia had altered the HOA's bylaws 3 years earlier. inserting clauses that gave her unilateral authority over emergency expenditures and compliance operations, including the hiring of outside contractors. One of those contractors turned out to be her nephew, operating under yet another shell company. He had billed the HOA for infrastructure inspections that never happened and community surveys that were never distributed. When investigators visited his listed address, it was a shuttered vape shop wedged between a pawn store and a payday loan office. As news of the investigation spread, more residents came forward. A retired schoolteacher named Nora brought in a stack of letters she'd kept in a shoebox, each one a warning from Patricia about non-compliant decorative displays. Turns out, those displays were small ceramic gnomes Nora had placed in her garden. Patricia had cited them as unlicensed statuary. The real kicker: Nora's property wasn't even within the HOA's jurisdiction. Patricia had redrawn the neighborhood boundary map using software she downloaded from an open-source planning site, and then used the fake map to justify fines on at least a dozen homes that were never technically part of Oak Ridge. That bombshell landed hard. The city issued a formal retraction of all boundary changes made by the previous board. Every fine issued under the false map was declared void. Refunds were ordered, but the damage went deeper. One resident, a quiet man named Ellis, revealed that Patricia's forged citations had been used to place a lien on his home, one that nearly cost him a refinancing deal for his daughter's college tuition. The lien had been filed with a forged notary seal. That pushed the case into a new category: criminal forgery with financial harm. A grand jury convened within a month. Patricia's attorney tried to frame her as misguided but well-intentioned. It didn't stick. The evidence was overwhelming. Wire transfers, surveillance footage, forged documents, and over 24 sworn statements from residents. In court, Patricia sat rigid in a navy pantsuit, arms folded tightly. Her defense team tried to argue that the HOA granted her sweeping authority and that the residents had acquiesced to her leadership. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Kara Madsen, dismantled that theory in under 10 minutes. She projected a spreadsheet of financial transactions onto the courtroom screen. "These aren't oversight errors," she said calmly. "They're deliberate acts of deception. And if the court needs motive, look no further than the boutique hotel charges in Aspen during the same week." She claimed to be attending a municipal compliance conference. The jury took less than 3 hours to deliberate. Patricia was found guilty on 7 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of falsifying public documents, 3 counts of criminal impersonation, and 1 count of elder financial abuse. She was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, with a restitution order of $218,000 to be paid back to the Oak Ridge HOA. The community let out a collective breath, but we didn't stop there. With the help of Rachel and the city attorney, we proposed a new charter that would place the HOA under a dual oversight model. All major expenditures would require both board approval and third-party auditing. Every election would be monitored by the city clerk's office until further notice. And most importantly, no single board member would ever again have unchecked authority. We called a community meeting at the rec center. Over 90 residents showed up, more than had ever come to any HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. Lewis stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, the new bylaws on a projector behind him. "This is our neighborhood now, not a private fiefdom." Applause erupted. Some families brought food. Kids played outside while the adults signed the new charter one by one. The last signature came from Nora, who walked up with her walker, set down her pen, and said, "That gnome's going back in the garden tonight." The laughter that followed was the kind that comes after a long, hard winter, the kind that means spring is finally here. In the months that followed, Oak Ridge changed. Slowly but noticeably. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began organizing block parties. Sidewalk chalk art appeared on driveways. The community Facebook page, once a wasteland of petty complaints and threats, turned into a space for sharing tools, recipes, and weekend plans, and me. I never wanted to be a board member. Hell, I never wanted to deal with any of this. But sometimes, standing your ground means standing for more than just your own driveway. Patricia thought she ran a kingdom. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't the ruler, she was the storm, and storms pass, now the sun's out. And we're rebuilding, one neighbor at a time. 2 months after Patricia's conviction, the neighborhood had not only stabilized but started to thrive in ways most of us didn't expect. The board meetings were now held in the open-air pavilion behind the rec center, where residents sat in folding chairs and passed around lemonade instead of whispered complaints. But with Patricia behind bars and her grip shattered, other remnants of her reign began to surface, some even more alarming than anyone had anticipated. It started with an envelope, not mailed, hand-delivered to the new HOA mailbox, which we'd relocated to the rec center for transparency. The return address was scrawled in shaky handwriting, no name, just an apartment complex on the south side of town. I opened it, expecting another request for a tree trimming permit or maybe someone reporting their neighbor's Halloween decorations went up too early. Instead, it contained a single-page statement from a woman named Elise Garvey. She claimed to have worked as a part-time bookkeeper for Patricia 2 years ago off the books, paid in cash. She wrote that she quit after being asked to make adjustments to the HOA's legal fund ledger. But the real kicker was in the last paragraph. She said Patricia had used HOA funds to pay for private investigators. At first, I thought she meant background checks, maybe for board candidates or to harass residents. But Elise went further. She alleged that Patricia had authorized surveillance of specific homeowners who had pushed back against her decisions. Not just photos of lawns or trash bins, actual tailing, vehicle tracking, even audio recordings. I called Rachel again. She didn't wait. She contacted the city's legal counsel and then looped in the district attorney's office. By the following week, Elise was giving a sworn deposition. She handed over emails, old receipts, and even a burner phone Patricia had given her to use for board communications. The phone was a gold mine. It had messages to 2 private contractors, both ex-security consultants who specialized in discreet information gathering. One of them was registered in another state. The other, based less than 15 miles away, operating under a business license that had expired 4 years earlier. One of the messages read, "Follow O'Connell, want to know where he takes his kid after 6 p.m. The DA's office filed a motion for further investigation and forwarded the evidence to the state attorney general. The AG launched a secondary probe, this time looking into civil rights violations and illegal surveillance. We were told to keep it quiet, but word still spread. Understandably, it rattled people. Dana, the single mother who had been fined for her sunflowers, showed up to our next meeting with her jaw clenched. She watched our kids, that's what this is. She had someone watching them. Lewis, who hadn't spoken much since the trial, stood up and said, "We need to know how deep this goes." And who else helped her? We didn't wait to find out. We hired a licensed forensic IT consultant paid from the newly reviewed and publicly audited HOA budget to examine the old HOA laptops and the cloud storage Patricia had used. What he found wasn't just unsettling. It was illegal. There were audio recordings, over 100 of them, labeled by address. Most were mundane, dogs barking, sprinklers running, front door conversations, but a few were more serious. 2 of them captured Brenda and Mark arguing inside their garage. Another had someone humming in their backyard. It meant someone had planted devices. The devices themselves were never recovered, but the metadata proved the files had been uploaded from a single location, Patricia's home office, the one we thought had been cleared out before the trial. Rachel contacted the federal prosecutors already handling Patricia's case. The new evidence meant new charges: surveillance without consent, illegal wiretapping, and endangering minors. the state issued a warrant for her residence. Despite being in custody, her house hadn't been searched for surveillance equipment. When the warrant was executed, they found a locked cabinet behind a false wall in the garage. Inside were 3 laptops, 5 external hard drives, and a printed map of the neighborhood with certain homes circled in red ink. Mine was one of them. That discovery triggered a federal inquiry. The FBI reopened the case, adding new charges to Patricia's growing list. Her plea deal was revoked. She was transferred from the minimum security facility to a federal detention center pending a new trial. Meanwhile, Elise's testimony triggered a domino effect. One of the ex-security contractors confessed to installing audio devices under the eaves of certain homes paid in cash, instructed to keep quiet. He cooperated fully in exchange for immunity. I was called to testify again. This time, it wasn't about forged documents or fines. It was about the invasion of privacy, the intent behind it, and the fear it had caused. The courtroom was colder this time, more clinical. Patricia sat behind her attorney, expression unreadable, no longer wearing the smug defiance she once wore like armor. She looked smaller, diminished. The judge didn't waste time. The new charges stuck. The sentence was extended by another 18 years, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. We walked out in silence. Outside, Rachel handed me a copy of the new state guidelines being proposed for homeowner associations. "You were the catalyst," she said. "This case is going to change how HOAs are regulated across the state." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, grateful it was finally over. Back in Oak Ridge, the aftermath took time to settle, but something unexpected happened. The fear that had once pulled the neighborhood apart had now been replaced by something stronger: unity. People who had once avoided eye contact now shared meals. Kids used chalk to draw hopscotch boards on sidewalks. Carl donated a flagpole to the rec center, and Lewis organized a community safety seminar. We even started a tradition: every year on the anniversary of the neighborhood's charter reform, we hold a block party. We call it Independence Day. Mark built a barbecue rig from scratch. Brenda runs the pie contest. Dana's sunflowers are now part of the community garden. Even Carl's telescope has a new purpose: he teaches astronomy to the local kids on clear nights. As for me, I stepped down from the board after the first term. Not because I was tired, but because it was time to let others lead. I still go to meetings, I still help when needed. But now I focus on my son, on rebuilding the life we came here to start. The mailbox stands straight. The cameras still run, and the HOA. No longer a weapon, but a tool, a resource for the people it was meant to serve. Patricia thought she could bend a neighborhood to her will. Instead, she